I'll go ahead and take us live.
All right.
Okay, stand by. You're live.
Good afternoon and welcome to the June 30th, 2021 meeting of the Short-Term Rentals Working Group. My name is Brent Stockwell. I'm an Assistant City Manager for the City of Scottsdale. This is the sixth and final meeting of the working group, and the group purpose is identified on the agenda shown on the screen. It was formed to examine existing laws and tools available to the city regarding short-term rentals, and tasked with working together to identify opportunities for the city to improve monitoring and enforcement of regulations to ensure Scottsdale is doing everything it can to manage the impacts from short-term rentals. Shane, we do not have any spoken comment tonight, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, and all of the written comments that we had received have been uploaded and are available via the link on the agenda. So the remaining item that we have tonight is to discuss any public comment received, review the final draft recommendations documents that was sent out, I believe, last Friday, and then finalize the recommendations today. The recommendations following this meeting will be shared with the city manager and with the city council, and the city council will be discussing these recommendations and giving direction to staff at the July 1st meeting. So tomorrow night, that meeting, the regular meeting starts at 5 p.m. And so this is a scheduled item on the meeting, and anybody can comment on that item as well at that meeting. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop sharing the agenda and then start sharing the a Word document that has the recommendations so that we can review those through one last time and make any changes before I finalize these and send them to the city council. So let me share the other document. And Shane, please let me know when that is visible.
I can see it now.
Okay. So I am going to make sure I have the participants list up. So if you want to speak, raise your hand. What I'm also going to do is once we get through kind of each one of the major recommendations, I'll just kind of ask for a raised hand to make sure everybody is in agreement with them so we can move forward. Just talking through this quickly, I did add this summary sentence overall that the recommendations were designed to increase the likelihood that impacts can be prevented and minimized, that enforcement is timely when violations occur, that residents are informed about how to handle problems, and that ordinances reflect the authority granted to the city under state law. I thought that was a summary that was good based on the whole of the conversation we've had over the prior 5 meetings. Then the first recommendation is the improve enforcement against properties who regularly violate the ordinances. And so I summarized these both over the short term and the long term. And we can talk through each and answer any additional questions people have. But under the first recommendation 1A, wrote it so that we are assigning sufficient resources to this effort to identify potential problems before they occur, provide a rapid response, follow up to ensure resolution, and close the loop with the person making the complaint to ensure concerns are addressed. So basically some criteria that we can evaluate how the enforcement is being improved. I'm going to keep running through this until I see a raised hand. So the second one was one we obviously talked about in a lot of detail last time. That is evaluating the need for a short-term rental and nuisance party response team based on a review of, boy, I have a lot of people look at this and I still notice typos when I read it. A review of data on calls for service, response time, and the enforcement action needed. This should include focused efforts with increased resources during anticipated high activity times of the year. The one thing that I wanted to highlight here that really came out in staff discussions following last meeting is that the response team of 6 officers, 1 sergeant and code inspector, there is a lead time to that. The chief told me that it is typically about an 18-month process to get police officers on board. So that's why we went back and added the additional kind of short-term recommendation ahead of that. I just wanted to be completely clear with everyone about that, because at our last meeting, I don't think it was clear to people, especially if they were listening and expecting that if the council gave direction on this at tomorrow night's meeting, that we would have a new team, available immediately. Chief, is there any additional comment you want to make to that? I don't see any questions.
No, sir, you covered it. As we discussed, I could try to put things in place in a tiered fashion to create something, a little quicker. But, as far as actually receiving those new positions and then getting them filled and getting folks through the police academy and everything else to staff that unit, 18 months is probably reasonable.
Thank you. And I just wanted to help people understand how this document is structured. If you see something in light gray, like here at the bottom, this update police communications procedures to refer calls to the response team, that was something that was added after the original version that went out on Friday. So I did receive comments from working group members and staff. And so I did make some minor changes like that and tried to highlight that so everybody can see it. Carl, your hand is raised. Go ahead.
My only suggestion here, I agree with what you did with 1A and 1B. I understand the reality of staffing. I think that under the vague comment, assign sufficient resources, I mean, that's it's a great intention, but it's not specific. There should be, and a reality is it's 18 months, right? Takes time. Is there a transition plan? It's not perfect. How are you going to get, so the question, it begs the question in my mind, how do you get from A to B? How does that happen? What's the plan?
Brent, this is Rich. I can respond to that.
Go ahead.
Thanks, Carl. So that's kind of what I was alluding to just now, is that we can put special details together, especially around what we believe to be high activity timeframes related to our special events and other activities that are occurring in the city. I can build those on a temporary basis during those high activity times to try and start to meet this goal earlier than the 18 months. But recognize that I'd be taking resources from other parts of the organization. There's something's going to give them. There's going to be some workload that will be getting pushed aside a little bit so we can meet this need. And we'll roll through that as we're moving towards getting fully staffed and getting those additional positions. Does that kind of answer your question, sir?
Yes, sir. That makes sense.
Okay, thank you.
So would it be helpful to add in here, this staff comments here was intending to say some of the things that had already been done and would continue to be done to improve this in the interim. Do we need to add something about the special details in here? Chief, to make that more clear to the public and the council, what our intent is?
Certainly. Yeah, I can add a few statements there to sort of describe maybe what that tiered approach looks like towards our final goal.
Okay. So let me see. How about the police department will use special details?
Sorry. Yeah, I didn't know what you were going to do right now.
Yeah, I'd like to get it done because I want to get this out to the council immediately following the meeting if I can. So
the police department will assign officers to special details. on an as-needed basis related to, I'm sorry, I'm going a little fast for you. Related to known high activity timeframes related to special events and or any other actionable intelligence.
All right, Vice Mayor.
I would like to suggest that you put in that it will take about 18 months to be up to speed, because otherwise we're going to have people complaining and saying, why isn't this working? Why aren't you doing da, da, da? But if you put in that it's going to take about 18 months, I think that will take some of the heat off of all the complaints.
Thank you. I have it noted here in the staff comment. There will,
Okay.
Is that sufficient or?
Let me just read it. I read through and didn't see it.
It's highlighted on the screen now in the staff comment under 1B.
Okay, I see it. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. You're welcome. Okay, so any other comments on items, recommendations 1A or B? So we did highlight the 24-hour hotline concept here and the potential concerns associated with it because people will typically call 911. And we relate, we connected this to the improving communications recommendation as well. This is something that is definitely offered as part of some of the technology platforms, and I think will be evaluated as part of that as well. And then on this one, 1D, the city should increase communication about enforcement efforts and measure and report progress over time, such as reduction in number of complaints. And then evaluating also the 2-person business regulation task force to see whether that intensive focus on registration and taxation review should continue. So those are what we have now under recommendation 1. Any other comments about any of those or questions? All right, I see Carl and then Bobby. Carl, go first.
Oops, sorry, I muted then unmuted. I don't know whether it's something that's addressed later, but I when it comes to ordinance and when it's, for example, the advertising on the site specifically, I think you said they couldn't do it in specific to state or not state, but there's no mention of how they can try to highlight those hosts that are not abiding by ordinance, and they're essentially doing false advertising. And is that addressed later, Brent?
I think so, but Carl, if it's not, why don't you loop back around to it at the end? Would that be fine?
You bet.
Bobby, go ahead.
Hey, thanks. I just had a quick question regarding kind of all of these, but I think this is probably the best place to highlight. Do we have anything in place for, so it takes 18 months to implement this measure, but how about beyond that in terms of metrics, determining performance? Does this work? Does this not work? Do we have anything or suggestions we're going to offer to the council on how long that period or review period should be and what those metrics might be to determine if it's valuable or not?
That was what we were intending to have covered through this one right here. So 1D that's on the screen. But I'm looking to see if there's something we could do to strengthen that further. And if you note in the staff comment too, it talks about providing a quarterly report to the council and community, and including possibly the neighborhood advisory commission to keep informed on the work the city's doing, including measures in the quarterly performance report. Those were all attempts to kind of keep evaluating this on an ongoing basis. Is that sufficient or?
Yeah, I think so. In terms of it, time-wise would make sense. But as far as the specific metrics, that's something that, for example, the council would come up with, or the police would come up with, or that the city would look at in terms of calls for service versus violations versus things that don't materialize. So maybe a little more specific as far as, because obviously performance metrics and measures are only as good as what they're measuring. And so I'm just wondering, is it just going to be the neighborhood advisory, or is it going to be the, other resources that are pushed that direction?
Yeah. Let me have Assistant Chief Slavin talk about that. Go ahead, Rich.
Thank you, sir. Related to enforcement directly, we would measure performance much like we do with every other unit, on productivity, number of violations identified. They would submit monthly reports on intelligence that they gathered. We would start to build some foundation around maybe bad actors versus folks that we never seem to have any issues with. So we would measure their performance on their response times, their enforcement, actual tangible enforcement that they're taking, and so on. I think if you're asking more holistically about this entire program and how we measure and report out, then I think we should also look at how many short-term rentals were identified and then either voluntarily or through notification signed up properly with the city. We should probably measure all those things. But as far as 1A through 1D goes, I think that was really looking directly at what metrics we're collecting regarding enforcement. But you do bring up a point that maybe we should look at that a little broader as we report back.
Right, and sorry to piggyback on that, and just how long do you think it would take to look at that? I mean, quarterly reports are great, but those are going to be subsets of what the entire picture would be to determine if the measures make sense and if they are fruitful. I mean, do you think 18 months? Is it 12, 36? What would that look like to determine everything we're getting makes sense?
From an enforcement standpoint only, pretty much every unit in the department reports out monthly on their productivity. And then we would, with a new unit in deployment like this, I would probably be taking a six-month look to see how effective we are, if we need to make any changes, shift changes even, or deployment size of the unit changes. And then, but we will always report annually. And I think that's a good maybe mile marker, would be an annual report to determine what we're doing right and how effective we are, or if we need to make any changes or keep things going. We might also find that, hey, we really got ahead of things in this year and we can even start to back things down a little bit. But for me, I would look at this for a solid year from an enforcement perspective. And I'll let the others comment from their sides of this.
Thank you, Chief. I'll go ahead and go to David Mason first. David, go ahead.
It strikes me that we're in the process of starting to spend a lot of money here, hiring police officers and doing all this other stuff.
David, would it be possible to speak up a little bit more? You're coming through pretty softly. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, is this better?
Yeah, a little better, yeah.
Okay, yeah. What I'm saying is that we're spending an awful lot of money to do this, and I have no problems against it. Are we going to track how much money we're spending to enforce, to take care of the problems created by SB 1350 and report that back to the state and to the governor and to the public, so they can know that as a result of the city's trying to take care of the problems created by SB 1350, we're spending horrendous amounts of money and time, and they could have been devoted to other things, so that perhaps we can get some traction in the legislature to say something needs to be done. Any thought to do collecting statistics that would be useful for that purpose? Well, that's all I have.
Thank you. I think that, I mean, I think that is included in one of the later recommendations, but perhaps not specifically enough. So I know that's in item 9, and so let's take a look at it in item 9.
Okay, that's fine. We'll wait till we get.
You know, and I appreciate Chief Slavin's response to that is the type of thing that staff would do in carrying out this recommendation. So we were trying not to get into an excessive amount of detail in there, and really only saying that, hey, we should be having regular communication about how we're doing with this, and we should be measuring and reporting progress over time. And of course, there are a lot more other things to report on other than just the reduction in number of complaints. Any improvements more needed here in recommendation 1 based on the gist of this conversation? Or is there a sufficient understanding, and do we want to keep moving on? I'll look by hand raises. And David, I'll lower yours. So I guess I'll do this by objection. So if there's no objection, I'm going to move on from recommendation 1 to recommendation 2. Recommendation 2 is working with the short-term rental industry to increase properties providing emergency contacts and improve voluntary compliance and ensure input from the industry is received prior to implementing any recommendations. It's just a best practice that we do with any regulation for businesses. So we have this list here. I don't think this list changed dramatically from the prior version. I did clarify point number 4 here to add that not only are we providing feedbacks to the platforms on the experience of Scottsdale residents that provide complaints to the platforms, but we will also monitor the platform's response to residents. That was feedback that received after this went out. Related to this item, it was included in the staff report that Airbnb did send out an email to their properties, and we did get a significant bump in contact information received immediately following those emails. That was noted in the staff report. Bobby, you had your hand raised. Did you have a comment here?
No, I was just going to just say exactly what you did. I had a number of folks forward me that message that came from Airbnb, and it was, I mean, every single one of them that asked what it was, I said, well, this is exactly what we're trying to come up with. Had said, well, they just didn't know that they were supposed to do it with the city, even though they had done it with DOR. So I think that was already a really good thing that you guys had done, and that obviously had some benefit to us.
Excellent. So, based on this recommendation, based on the feedback we get from council, tomorrow we would start working with all the different platforms to do something similar. And I have heard from Airbnb that they are still working on another round of communications to encourage that further and to increase compliance. So, all right. Any questions, comments on recommendation 2? No objection. I'll move on to 3, which unfortunately is crossing pages now, but this is the one about using technology to identify and increase emergency contacts and compliance from short-term rentals. So this one you can all see on the screen. I also don't think this one changed significantly from last meeting. We have staff has met with additional solution and has another one set up. So we're continuing to learn more about what's provided. Basically, these are the key things that are provided by most platforms. They would help us identify the short-term rentals operating in Scottsdale. They would help us increase the properties for whom we have complaint and emergency contacts. I think all of them we talked to would help us set a target of a percentage of all of the short-term rentals listing in Scottsdale at any point in time, and work toward increasing the percent for which we have contact information. The solutions also provide tools for monitoring listings to proactively identify potentially problematic properties, including those that are not listing their tax number, should have a comma, those advertising occupancies with more than 6 adults and their dependent children, and those advertising properties as party houses or event rentals. My understanding from listening to a number of these is there are properties that will come into compliance, then go out of compliance, then be caught again. So obviously the technology solutions are marketing themselves as helping the city with monitoring them more proactively. Automating enforcement efforts such as letters and notices. And then I think most of them also offer some version of a 20 short-term rental complaint hotline. So we've been contacting cities. We would go through a process of determining how the systems will be used and by whom within the city, identify necessary funding, plan for the implementation, and then procure the technology that best fits our needs. That's what that one's all about. Unless I see any hand raised, I'm going to go to the next one. So this is recommendation 4 is ensuring Scottsdale is collecting all allowable revenue from short-term rentals and analyzing whether fines can be increased. So one of the efforts that the task force in the business regulation area has done is looking at properties and comparing those with their licenses with Department of Revenue to ensure that they are they have a tax license. Improving the process for issuing notices of violation and the process for handling appeals for police service fees to limit the number of fees that need to be reduced. So that's processes in place. That's an improvement that's happened during the work of the working group. It's covered below in recommendation 5C as well, because there's also an ordinance change recommendation. And then reviewing the fines and creating a sliding scale. We also talked about that at last meeting. So that would be included in here and could be included in the ordinance as well. Any questions, comments about that? Hearing none. Bobby, go ahead.
Brent, hey, just a quick question to circle back around to those, and maybe I'm not seeing it. Is our recommendation that those fines and violations would be indefinite, or would there be a reset period after a certain amount of time, or what's our thought on that?
I recall that is covered below. I think it said it's in the next section, and it was within a two-year. I don't want to misspeak. I know it's below.
Okay, no worries. No worries.
Let me find out the answer to that question, and then I'll go to. It is here in 5C, and it would define the habitual offender as someone who commits a violation of the nuisance party and unruly gathering ordinance after previously having been found responsible for 3 or more violations within a 2-year period. So if it was a longer period than that, it wouldn't be a habitual offender. I'm actually going to go to Deputy City Attorney Luis Centella and have him comment on that since he has his hand raised. Go ahead, Luis.
So in answer to your question, yes, the fines would reset. Right now, the police service fees, the basis is 6 months, where priors within 6 months count for the aggravated amount. So for these sliding scale fines, which are civil fines, that would be set in the ordinance, and it would probably be something similar, 6 months. The other thing that Brent was referring to is when people totally disregard these civil citations and where they fail to pay their responsibilities and they get 3 or more in 2 years, that's when they could be prosecuted criminally. So that's a slightly different issue from the reset question.
I appreciate that clarification. Bobby, any other questions on that, comments?
Well, one other question I had with looking back to the statute was that under the statute that I read, it says that if there's multiple violations within one call, so to speak, that those should be treated as one. And I thought last time we had talked is that those would be treated individually. And so I was just trying to figure out why those didn't necessarily comport, or is it different from the state? It also said that the city had a certain number of days to let the state know if there was any violations by short-term rental. So is the ordinance going to mimic whatever the statute is, or is it going to deviate a bit?
No, it's going to be different because that's a different standard. So those are verified violation. And what a verified violation is after someone is found either responsible of a civil violation or guilty of a criminal violation, then the city can report that to ADOR. And if the fine is more, than what ADR will impose, then ADR doesn't impose anything. The difference is, let's say a short-term rental was cited for a nuisance party, for littering, and also for operating an event center. Those would be 3 different charges. Under the city ordinance, they could be fined for each one of those. The way ADOR looks at that is that would only be one event, and they wouldn't fine for 3 different charges. They would just charge for the one event. But that ADOR practice of verified violations does not limit our enforcement ability whatsoever. Basically, what a verified violation is the potential for the state to impose an additional fine on top of whatever city's imposed. The timeline I think you're referring to is if a short-term vacation rental has registered with the city, they're supposed to be notified within 70 days, not 7 days, 70 days, 7 days, whether a citation occurred on their property. There is no remedy in the statute for failing to do that, but it's basically a courtesy provision for the city to let the operator know that a citation was issued. So presumably with the hope that that owner would know about it and take remedial measures in the future.
Thank you. Bobby, any other questions or comments on that?
No, I think that helps out. Thank you.
Okay, I appreciate it. Rebecca, go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. My question was in regards to the fines and the violations. Are those publicly available? Is that public information?
Luis, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah. So you're asking whether the fines are public information?
Correct.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So the way
Okay.
it works is someone will be cited into city court, right? A fine is not imposed until they're found responsible, meaning the burden is on us to prove the violation. Sometimes people will default and not show up in city court, then a default judgment is entered. But once a final judgment is entered, it is public information. You can actually go if you go to there are various websites that like public access to Arizona court, where you can actually look up pretty much any court case in the state that will give you some information. The city court has a website too, where you can look up court information, but it is public information, whether it's online or not. It depends.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And I think the other side of it too is that we would make sure and communicate in all of our communications to short-term rental owners and hosts what the penalties are associated. So we'd also make that very public so people understood what the penalties were for non-compliance. Bobby, go ahead.
And just to verify, let's say that there's a short-term rental that gets sold to a new owner. These violations would start over, agreed, or does it go by the property or by the operator?
They would start over. It's by the owner
Okay, thanks.
or the occupant. And I think it was your question previously, the statute does say once a verified violation occurs, meaning the finding of guilt or responsibility, the city is supposed to report it to ADOR within 30 days. So it wasn't that 7-day period that you were talking about. So just wanted to provide you that update.
Okay, thanks.
All right. Any other questions on the revenue recommendation? The next one is recommendation 5 on Scottsdale ordinances and being strengthened to eliminate loopholes and improve the ability to enforce. So the first one is reviewing all the other ordinances to see if codes could be strengthened, and talked how we've done that. One of the things that was identified in particular was the requiring an emergency contact to respond within 1 hour. And that is the next recommendation, 1B, requiring the emergency contact to respond in person to a short-term rental within 1 hour for emergencies, to include nuisance parties and unruly gatherings. That's recommendation 1B. I think that's very consistent with what we talked about last time. Also eliminating the police service fee and replacing them with civil sanctions, and the habitual offender language that I mentioned previously for someone who was ignoring the civil sanctions. Then the third one is related to noise. I think we did make some clarifications here. Addressing unreasonable noise to define excessive noise within the nuisance party and unruly gathering ordinance. And then, as I recall Luis mentioning this last time, it has both a reasonable person standard and also a standard if a sound level meter is used. And this is something that would still need to be determined, but this would be, depending on the direction given by the council, something that would be brought back in an ordinance probably early in the fall. We did talk about whether or not, at last meeting, whether or not lower noise levels could be mandated during particularly sensitive times. There was also this statement added that statements from neighbors about noise and disturbance would also be taken into consideration in determining the reasonable person standard. That's also consistent with what Luis had discussed at the last meeting. But Luis, if there's anything that needs to be added to that, please do so. All right. Then the next one was recommendation 5E, about a lot of the conversation we've had around the disconnect between the zoning ordinance occupancy requirements, the maximum of 6 adults and their dependent children, and the city's ability to effectively enforce that. We have gotten a lot of comments about that and also a lot of discussion about that. So clarifying the requirements, exploring ways to improve compliance, effectively educate people about the requirements as needed. We did clarify this as an item here to consider amending the ordinances to create opportunities that someone could take if they were willing to take certain steps that would be beneficial for managing the property moving forward. Included some language on there and how that's similar to how other enforcement issues are handled. 5G is exploring whether owner information could be required to be posted on site and all notices sent to the owner. Just note here that additional community outreach would be needed. Some people might be in favor of that, others may not. So we would really need more input from that. Then I wanted to comment on this because this is something we did talk about at our last meeting, and staff did do the research following that. So one of them was looking at all the complaints that we'd received to see if there was a data-informed reason to adopt additional regulations as allowed under state law. And we looked, we by saying we, I mean Kelly. She's the one that did this. Reviewed about the 300 complaints and found that of those, 121 were related to properties not being listed. And obviously there's a great concern about that. But then as you go through, 70 were related to noise. That's certainly something that's already included in the recommendation. 65 related to the number of occupants. That's already included in the recommendation. The other two areas that were next up were 54 related to trash and 37 related to parking. So the note made here is that it seemed that trash and parking could be something reviewed in more detail. And this is certainly what Sedona and Paradise Valley, I think, have both done. And then there's also comments in here that we've talked about at prior meeting about, and has come in through comments about Americans with Disability Act requirements. And then also a comment that we need to keep abreast of emerging trends and making sure that any additional adjustments are made as well. Ian, go ahead.
Yeah, I had got some information from, there seemed to be some feedback there. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine, yes.
Okay, I got some feedback. I got some feedback from code enforcement. There was a backlog of licenses or people who were saying they were short-term rentals within the city and the county. So when you look at the city map and the county information, it's not necessarily up to date, but in fact, they might have processed their registered their properties. Do you have a handle on that? Is that a problem?
It is definitely something that we've been working on. We've had some staffing changes, and so there was a lag between when people were submitting it through the Scottsdale Easy system and when they were being approved. A staff member has been assigned to work on that backlog, and and we've also created an internal dashboard so that we can look at the differences between the ones that are coming in on the Scottsdale Easy system and when they're being tagged as short-term rentals in the code enforcement system, which I believe is what actually updates the map. And so we've been working on that. Eric, I don't know if there's anything further to add to that. I know you've been much more close to that issue than I have.
Yeah, thanks, Brent. Yeah, that pretty much covers it. We are now kind of working much quicker towards that goal, and I anticipate the next 2 to 3 weeks will be within a day or two, only behind each time, which is pretty standard moving forward. So the number is quickly moving forward.
Yeah, we had a staff member out on medical leave that ended up being longer than we anticipated, and that added to the problem. But I think we've got that addressed, and we'll get it fixed moving forward.
Yep, correct, 100%.
Yep. Bobby, go ahead.
Thanks. So the question I have, and I think this kind of even circles back around to number one, but from a holistic standpoint, the complaints are, those are calls that are coming in for service, or they're calls that are coming into the code enforcement of the city, or where are those being tallied from exactly?
Yeah, those are coming in from the reported problem system, Scottsdale Easy, and they're ones where the person making the complaint tagged short-term rentals, and then what Kelly did was review the comment that was left about that property. So that's what those are, and they, I think, intent for the most part were more general comments. It was just a way to evaluate it.
Sure. And then the other question I had is maybe to circle back around. So the complaint system that's in place and that will be when we're working with the police, those all seem on the front end to be front end heavy with complaints. But how about as far as the follow through in terms of, are we going to keep track and make public which complaints or what number of complaints don't materialize into a violation, so that we can see? Obviously, it'd be one thing if we have a number of people calling in that don't end up turning into violations, and trying to see what that I hate to say conversion, but that conversion metric from a complaint versus an actual violation is.
That's good feedback. It's certainly something that could be done with the data. One of the challenges that we have is that, obviously some of the calls for service are coming in from the police department, some are coming in directly to code enforcement, others are coming in through the city's website. Both the PD and the code enforcement, the ones that are coming in through the website go directly to code enforcement. So ultimately, at the end, the code enforcement system is the one to really check, and we certainly could track and see what complaints resulted in enforcement action, which ones didn't, as part of the way to evaluate it. Certainly.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Any other questions, comments, observation under recommendation 5 relating to ordinance changes? All right. So the next 3 are relating to improving information. So the recommendation 6, improving information and resources shared with the city to help inform residents about what the city can and cannot do with short-term rentals, and to make it easier for people to contact the property managers and hosts when there are problems. So we've fleshed this all into one recommendation saying improving the quality and content of information shared with residents on how to report complaints directly to the city, how to report complaints to the online lodging marketplace platforms, how to improve the interface with the map and the complaint contact information, to make it easier to use, creating the how-to guide for residents living near short-term rentals on how to handle problems when they occur, developing workshops for residents on what to report and how to report violations, and publicizing information and workshops to residents and neighborhood groups, including neighborhood watch captains. And then also to explore whether complaints to the city could be automatically forwarded to the online lodging marketplace platforms as well. So that certainly is something that we pulled together through all the conversations. I have personally responded to every written public comment that has come into the working group, and in addition to having them posted and shared as part of your agendas. I would say a good number of them are related to people not knowing how to handle situations, and so I definitely think that we can make some improvement in this area. Any comments, questions? Carl, go ahead.
So I held back because throughout this entire draft, I understand that, and I want to make sure I'm clear, Brent, because I don't want to overstep what the purpose of this committee is. We're making this is going to council, and then council decides what they want to do. So that's why we use words like improve or assist or strengthen or explore. We don't want to be, we're trying not to be overly specific to keep it more general. I think am I reading that properly?
I guess what we're trying to do is identify areas that need to be improved so that we can so we have some flexibility in how that's done, but we also have some standards for that the working group members have identified about what needs to be improved. So if there's something more specific that needs to be there, we're certainly happy to include that in there.
No, I just think, like, when you look at 5, there's a lot in 5, right?
Yeah.
And there's things there that are really, really important. And we have an ordinance, but we can't enforce it. But on the other hand, if the how-to guide for residents explains, well, if you video who goes in the house at night and who comes out, because it's public, you can do that, and then signs an affidavit. I'm just curious how aggressive this, because like you said, you've communicated with everyone and they don't understand, but I think we all agree that understanding the current situation versus understanding the future situation are hopefully 2 different things.
Yeah, I understand, and I agree that 100%. Some of the comments have been about explaining what the current status is. I think there have been quite a lot that didn't even use the existing resources that were available to them, and I think we need to do a better job with that. That was the point I was trying to make. So,
Thank you.
but your point overall is very well taken. Councilmember Milhaven, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, Carl touched on something as I'm reading through the recommendations. I'm looking at the PowerPoint you gave us. Some of it says like evaluate. Well, that reads like we're going to do that, but we did do that. So this document is sort of reading like a combination of, excuse me, questions and suggestions from the task force, but it really could be stated more strongly to say the task force is recommending that we make these changes. So I think when Betty and when we talk tomorrow morning about how we present this to council, I really do think we need to strengthen this a little bit. And it's not evaluate, it's, implement the changes we identified when we had this conversation. So I think Carl touched on something that I had noticed to say that the language could be a little bit stronger.
Yeah, that's a good observation. And of course, we've been trying to respond to the problem at the same time that the working group is talking about developing solutions to it. So trying to find a way to share both has been a challenge at some point. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I don't want to do overly wordsmith or overly, argue about verb tenses and things, but I do think that there's some pretty strong recommendations in here that I think we can present it in that way.
Excellent. And to that point, since you referenced it, so the plan for tomorrow night is that the persons that will be presenting the working group's recommendation to the council are the council members themselves. So I have assisted them by pulling together a PowerPoint presentation that we're going to review and have that ready to go tomorrow night. So thank you. So the next one is relating to assisting neighborhoods, including homeowners associations, with information and resources on how to manage short-term rentals, prepare information to share with residents, as well as HOAs and similar neighborhood groups, including neighborhood college class or educational mediation resources. I know we talked about that at a prior session as well. Improving education about short-term rental best practices. So working with the platforms, property management companies, short-term rental owners and hosts to identify best practices, prepare information to share with all short-term rental contacts, including information about the ordinances and state laws, and the contact list and summary, and then sharing that information out. So that certainly came out as a recommendation as well. Councilmember Milhaven and then Vice Mayor Janik.
Yeah, could we add to this list? It would be great if they could, if operators could provide information to the renters to say, when you have a short-term rental, you need to provide the following information to your renters. And it'd be things like, describing nuisance parties and excessive noise, and that if we get a call, we're going to be on site in an hour and blah, blah, blah. And these are the fines. Can we say that we would require operators to provide that to their tenants?
Yeah, that was intended to be here. I can make it stronger. So including
I read it a couple of times. Yeah, I read it a couple of times. I thought you could read it that way, but I'm not sure if we could call it out more clearly, that would be better. Thank you.
And you said like listing out noise ordinance requirements. I think that I'm trying to remember some of the things you mentioned.
Here, short-term rental contacts, and I don't know that specifically means the people who are renting the property, right? So if I'm a person occupying a short-term rental, there should be something that says, here are the rules and regulations, and here are the penalties, and here are the consequences. So it's not just for because when you read the contacts, it could be just the operator, and the operator may or may not pass that along to the tenant. But if we require the operator to inform the tenant, that may have folks thinking twice about being noisy.
Yeah.
And trash and all that other stuff, when we have the guidelines about, what it means to be a good operator, what does it mean to be a good tenant, right?
Yeah.
You got to clean up after yourself, blah, blah, blah. No trash.
So I put it as a separate bullet there to require owners and hosts to provide a city services contact list and summary of laws and ordinances to share with guests.
Perfect. Thank you.
Listing out trash, listing out such things as trash and noise ordinance requirements. Is that
Yeah.
clear?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then Vice Mayor, go ahead.
I was going to suggest, and I'm not sure if it belongs here or someplace else, that we need to make sure that when we roll out this program, that we use all the local media sources to announce that this program is being implemented. Because I think if more people know about it, we will have much better compliance. So if you could somewhere put in there, also include local news media, et cetera, with announcing these changes once it's in its final format.
Okay.
Thank you.
Melissa, go ahead.
Thanks, Brent. So going back to that, where we just were about the kind of requiring a notice to the renters, there, I think actually I would just like to add that the number one thing I think to say is capacity, and that the law is that no more than 6 adults overnight, even though a lot of these places are, like the one next to me is advertised as Sleeps 12, host your party here. So I think sometimes that's a surprise to the tenants, and something really that they should know.
Agreed. I added occupancy limits. And the one thing I'll add to that, because I have spent some time looking at this issue as we've received comments, and I think it's already covered in the ordinance recommendation relating to occupancy limits, but I think there's some additional changes to the ordinance that we might be able to do to make this more clear about requiring it up front before people rent the places, that they understand the limits that we have. So thank you. Ian, you are next.
Thank you. Just another word on getting the word out. Would it be appropriate to put some kind of flyer in the water bill?
Okay.
You're thinking too long on that one, so that's probably not.
No, I'm typing. Requirements or something like that.
Or work group findings, or.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Rebecca, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I need to go back to where you were on the screen about the requiring. Sorry, I didn't have it pulled up. I was looking on your screen. Yeah, on the requiring the owners and hosts to provide that information listed there is.
Yes.
What is the practical way of, I mean, if you're requiring something, how are you planning on making sure that that's actually happen? And I use the example of, like, our realtors have to provide a lead-based paint brochure for houses of a certain age, and they have to have something that signs off that on that says that they did provide it. So I'm just trying to figure out how practically you can require owners to do that and verify that they've actually done that.
That is a good observation, and precisely why I probably have used a more ambiguous language in many sections, so that we had, so that the council and the working group members and the public could know that we were following up on all these issues, but recognize some challenges that we might get into in trying to implement them. So from a compliance standpoint right now, looking to see if the tax license number is on the listing is something we can do. We can look. If it's not there, we can issue a notice. The notice is active until it's there, right? That's something we could do. language about occupancy. We can also require that. We can look at it and make sure it's done. It gets to be more of a challenge to, govern something that's happening between the owner and host and the renter directly. But maybe, Rebecca, I should turn that back on you. I mean, how are you able, as in your profession, to demonstrate compliance for those types of requirements?
Yeah, I mean, it really comes down to documentation, disclosures that are signed by both parties, all of that kind of thing. And I'm just wondering, obviously you don't want this to be some ridiculously cumbersome activity that no one's going to want to do. Is it some kind of an electronic sign off via the platforms, or, I'm just trying to figure out something that would make sense.
Frank, can I make a suggestion?
Yes, go ahead.
So one of the things that we can do is when someone registers their emergency contact information and their complaint contact information, we could send them the summary to be posted and tell them it's a requirement to post it. So that way they at least know about it. The other thing, I was looking at some of the suggestions by RBO and Airbnb in terms of how to be a good operator. They suggest to their host platforms or the Airbnb location, TRB, that the operators post the local regulations, including their house rules. So this may be something that's actually not unusual for the industry to do, at least in some places. But at a minimum, we could, when we get them registered, we could send them what they're supposed to post, and then just have them send us a confirmation that they've posted it. Now, it's not a perfect mechanism, but it will at least get probably pretty good compliance.
Thank you. Rebecca, does that?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess then I go back to what are the numbers on, these platforms and which ones are going to actually be able to accommodate that process and which ones are not. I just see that as being an issue.
I hear you. I understand what you're saying. So that's something that we'll have to explore in the implementation of this, and then also, include in reports back to the council on how well this is working. Carl, do you want to go ahead?
So sorry. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
I thought I was muted, but I guess I wasn't. I love what Luis and what this conversation has just been about, because it resonates for section 2A, 3A, 5E. Okay, I mean, for example, you talk about automated, working with the platforms, having communication with them. They clearly, like Bobby mentioned, they sent an email out to all the Arizona owners and hosts, right? That and there was a response to that. Why can't we do that? That says, oh, by the way, here are the rules. And also on the electronic part of the advertising aspect in 3A, if we see that they're falsely advertising, sleeps 25, right? Perfect for your event. I mean, it's clearly a violation. I think Luis said it's hard to enforce that. But on the other hand, it's not hard to bring it to the platform's attention that, oh, by the way, they're violating our ordinance and they're on our radar. Is that, and especially if it can fall into the automated aspect of it, it would be fantastic.
In one of the platforms, I think it's Airbnb, one of their rules is you can't have parties of more than 16 people. So sometimes whether we can prove it, it certainly could be reported to Airbnb as a violation of their rules.
Yeah, and when we met with Airbnb and VRBO, they were open to receiving lists of properties that had received multiple notices. So that's they certainly were open to receiving that. I mean, we can't control what they do, but
Right. But like a nod to what Rebecca was saying, it's
yes.
if you're having that communication, here's a list of rules.
Yeah.
Can you please have your owners and hosts sign acknowledgement that they've received this? That would be helpful.
Yeah, and it helps also with the notice, both to the owners and to the renters of what the city's requirements are, so that if there is a problem, they all should have known about it in advance. Thank you. David, go ahead.
I just want to step in, following up on this very same issue. I think that we might explore, and I'm not sure how to do this just yet, but requesting that the host include acknowledgement of the major city ordinances that we're trying to enforce here, the noise, the occupancy, everything, as part of their registration process. So when the person signs up on a site, on a platform for a particular property, part of the platform means that they acknowledge that they have been provided a copy of the pertinent regulations. Therefore, once they have acknowledged that, then when the police go by to enforce the ordinance, they can't claim ignorance of the ordinance. So that might be one thing we could explore, having them add acknowledgement of things like trash and occupancy and noise and things like that to the sign up procedure, so that we have a positive closure of that, not only from the host who has to acknowledge receipt of that, but also from each one of the people who are renting it, the renters acknowledge it. Then we've got a closed loop. It gets it. I think it does a better job of getting it in, and that was my comment on it. I don't think that they should have any trouble adding that to their sign-on process. They put a lot of stuff in there now, and that gets back to the way that we enforce things like the lead-based paint ordinances. It's just, if you want to buy a house, or you want to rent a house, you sign this ordinance, or you sign this acknowledgement of disclosure. And if you don't want to do it, then you don't sign it. You don't get in. It's simple.
So David, I knew we could, so we could include this within the city's complaint and emergency contact sign up process and acknowledgement of that. I think if we were going to require the platforms to do that, that might be something that would require a state law change. But I think we could, as you were talking through it, there's a form that they have to fill out to do their emergency contact with the city. We could, we could include a link to the city's rules and ask them to acknowledge receipt of that. That could probably go along the lines with this other recommendation as well, about requiring them to post a list of the rules.
Well, that might, if there was some way that we could request them is play the good corporate citizen card, that they want their renters to be good good citizens of the communities that they go into. And that way Airbnb or those people are showing that they're good corporate citizens by saying, hey, renter, here are the rules in this particular town. Acknowledge that you've seen those rules. Now they could do that across the board. We could ask them as part of being good corporate citizens to manage the problems of out of control Airbnbs. It might be a good thing. And then they could claim, look, we're making sure that people know what the rules are, so that they know that they can't have big loud parties here. They know they can't have 50 people in the property.
So Brent is correct. The law would not allow us to regulate the online platform. They're even more protected than the short-term rentals themselves. But we could certainly ask them to voluntarily do that.
That was my point. I realize that we can't do much with anybody right now except ask them to please comply. But I think we can probably get the owners to at least acknowledge that they've seen it and they are aware that they should try to make their renters aware of these ordinances, either through posting it or something else, and then go back to the, as you say, the Airbnbs of the world and see if they can want to play the good corporate citizen and do what's right. So that was my main comment on this. I just think it might be a way to further get our point across that we just don't want loud parties here in Scottsdale.
Okay, so what I did to try and address that, David, is I put it back up here in 2 and said discuss ways that the platform could make owners, hosts, and renters aware of Scottsdale's ordinance requirements. And so we can go back to the, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense, because we were already talking to them about requesting the industry take action to remove properties that refuse to comply with and violate Scottsdale's ordinances or state laws. It certainly makes sense to talk to them about how we could better make people aware of those requirements in the first place. So I did include that in. Thank you. Rebecca, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you, David. You kind of took it down the path I was headed, and I do love the discussion about an acknowledgement, disclosure and acknowledgement component that possibly could be a suggested legislative addition. So I think that could take care of such a whole host of problems, because you would be assuring there was that education component and information going out, and you could also be assured that it was received, or at least they had the opportunity to receive it, and making that acknowledgement would really be a stronger message about what those rules are.
How about if I put that down here under the next one where it says allow a city, or maybe, and Brad Lendall may want to jump in here, but require online lodging, what do they call online lodging marketplace platforms. Rebecca, what was it you said? An acknowledgement? What was
it's a disclosure of the ordinances and requirements, or municipality requirements, or whatever, however that would be worded, and an acknowledgement by the short-term renter that it was reviewed and received and reviewed, etc.
I put that in there so that we actually have it in 3 places. So we've tackled this issue by improving the information we provide to the short-term rental owners, hosts, and guests. We're also including it in our discussions with the online lodging marketplaces, and we're also adding it into the changes to state law that we would like to see. Does that address it satisfactorily, Rebecca, from your standpoint?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, Ian, go ahead.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a lot of other booking websites other than VRBO and Airbnb. And I don't believe everybody who goes, or anybody who goes to like Good Night Stay or Home to Go, their booking goes on to Airbnb and VRBO also. Now, are we just limiting a lot of these rentals because we're only looking at these 2 top players?
No, the intent is we started with those 2 because my understanding is they represent about 70% of the market. The intent is to work with all of the platforms.
Okay.
Yeah, my understanding there's I have heard about 25, and of course varies because there are some local specific ones as well. But we're not intending it just to limit to the big 2, for lack of a better term. We're intending to communicate this with all, and this requirement, the online lodging marketplace platforms term, which is a term in state law, I think is referring to any of those.
Okay, so maybe a priority would be set on the lesser ones if they became problem party houses and stuck out like a sore thumb. So say, okay, we need to go talk to these people.
Got it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Carl, go ahead.
Well, you jumped to 9, so I had something here I hesitated to even bring up.
I will, do you want to, was it on
Well, oh,
9 or
wait,
you want to go
it's
back
on
to
9.
8?
It's on 9. So you
Okay.
start talking about 9, so I raise my hand. So I'll lower my hand.
No, I think we were ready to talk about 9. So
Okay, perfect. Okay.
I think we had finished 8 and we were ready to go to 9. And of course, 9 is the one where we're talking about working with the state of Arizona to share how the city is using powers available to cities, advocating for necessary changes to state law, and to return short-term rental oversight to the city. So there are 4 recommendations in here. I'll just overview them and then we'll talk about it. The first one is working on needed changes to existing state laws, including improving the verified violation system and also developing improved information about how Scottsdale has been using the enforcement efforts. And I think that is where, to the prior comment, I forgot who made it, but also mentioning the amount of resources that the city is having to use to manage this challenge. There is an item here where the council members on the working group would write a letter to legislatures and other state officials to raise awareness, talk about the barriers, attaching the work that the working group has done. Continue to advocate for changes. You may recall a number of these. Brad Lendahl mentioned them at the very first meeting, and then we've just added this one based on the suggestion from the group. And then also acknowledgement about a citizen group needing to be formed to advocate for changes further. So go ahead, Carl.
Okay, so my issue, in fact, you can maybe delete this and don't even write it down if you don't want to. But if I understand this properly, going back to the beginning of Airbnb and VRBO, the intent was to create revenue for the homeowner. Hey, grandma wants to rent out a room. She needs to make a little extra money. And then, of course, the state legislature, they'd always bring that up. That'd always be a big deal that they'd talk about you're harming them. And it would have to do with, a property owner in other cities and municipalities have the right to rent out their guest houses. Okay. We have an ordinance that doesn't allow that. And I'm okay with that ordinance. But I thought in all fairness, we should at least bring it up, okay? Because when it comes to managing an unruly tenant, odds are if the homeowner's like 10 feet away, that tenant's not going to be unruly. There's not going to be parties there. And those are the biggest noise and multiple people and trash. Those are those biggest issues. And I didn't know if this, I'm not saying I'm in favor of this, but I in all fairness, I thought we as a working group, we should at least address it. And I should have brought this up in the first meeting and I didn't. And then I hesitated, but I figured since the last meeting, I might as well bring it up.
So Carl, just so I can state your concept
It's a question. It's a question. Do we want to have a discussion about this or not?
And the this is limiting it to owner occupied properties where the owner is on site.
Yeah, the city ordinance does not allow you to rent out your guest house. You can't do that. You
okay,
can't.
Luis raised his hand, so that signals to me there's something he wants to add to this particular comment. So Luis, go ahead.
So this
and then
policy,
we'll go to David afterwards.
So this policy predates short-term rentals. Under the Scottsdale zoning ordinance, it's always been unlawful to separately rent out your guest house. I'm sure there are people that do it, and we just don't know about it. So the planning department's policy has always been, in the way the ordinance is structured, has been you have to rent out the entire property, the main house and the guest house. You can't rent them out separately. Now, the ordinance could be amended by the city council to do that, but that would be within their purview. So it's an interesting consequence of the pre-existing zoning ordinances, and the reason it applies to short-term rentals is because it applies to all types of properties, owner-occupied or long-term rentals. So it wasn't designed for short-term rentals in mind.
I agree.
Please go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, it was never intended. It's always been there. I agree with you. I'm just saying there's been cases where, it's not a big deal. Police hasn't enforced, but now with the predominance of short-term rentals, it's becoming more for that person that's doing that, are we going to enforce that? It's a question, and maybe we just don't. Maybe we just pretend we never had this discussion. I just thought I'd bring it up.
Well, why don't we allow other people to weigh in on it if they also feel it's an important subject? And David, go ahead. You had your hand raised. Although we might have lost him altogether because his hand lowered and he disappeared. So I'll call on him when he gets back. Any other questions, comments about recommendation 9? Bobby, go ahead.
I just, there's two things that popped up. Under section 8, just talk about including modifications to the verified violations, which I think we talked about a while back, and develop improved information about enforcement efforts. So I'm interested to know, because I don't really see it spelled out in terms of what some of those modifications might be, or if those are enumerated below in B, C, and D. And then I'll say one more thing about C. So here's my concern. And when I saw this in the beginning, and I understand the density issue and I understand the separation issue, but one thing that always concerns me with government oversight has to do with governments picking winners and losers, right? So if we get into a situation where the city is going to determine who gets a license and who doesn't get a license, there's already density, there's already a number of folks that run short-term rentals. And so then at some point, it's going to become a function of the city picks who keeps their license or who would lose their license. And so I think that's something that needs to be considered if there's going to be a pursuit of a level of city oversight where where the city can determine specifically how many can be in a certain area. I mean, there's condo projects that specifically allow short-term rentals. And so if there's a separation difference or requirement in terms of feet, which is kind of like the way that the silver homes are. I mean, these are things that I think are going to have impacts that need to be looked at thoughtfully when it comes to limiting the licenses versus just enforcing a good neighbor policy or holding people accountable that are not being good operators.
All right. Thank you. I understand what you're saying. I did include a clarification under A to say such as those identified in recommendation 9C, so that that ties A and C together, because I think A came before we fleshed out C in between the last meeting and this meeting. David, you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I had it raised before, but I dropped offline.
Yeah, I called on you and you disappeared. So
yeah, well, my internet connection disappeared.
Okay,
So,
go ahead.
I wanted to review with you the point I had raised earlier about how we can help get ahead of the current trend in the use of shared fractional ownerships to circumvent short-term rental regulations. When that was a concept coming out of California, it's been used to invade parts of California where people see pushback from short-term rentals. So what they do is they get a group of 8 or 10 or 12 or 15 or 20 people, and they go in and they buy a house and they go and use it, and it's their house to use. And of course, it's the same net effect, because now then people letting their friends and relatives go use it, and or claimed friends and relatives. And I just wondered if there's something we can look at about how to get ahead of this, because it's outside of short-term rentals. It's not doesn't seem to be an SB 1350 issue, and maybe we can get ahead of it and shut it off the path with some good ordinance creation. Just
yeah, and I mean, I have it noted up above. I can take it down and put it here. So I guess I'll hear from others to see if how important that is to include in this section. I'll let others raise hand. Melissa, you have your hand raised.
I just wanted to respond to Bobby's comment. Thanks for that good comment. And in regards to 9C, I know we're leaving it in the recommendations. I'm just really in support of leaving it in there, because I think it speaks to just allowing the city to do these sorts of things if they want to, not necessarily the how. like the how of how would Scottsdale dole out licenses. And then I also know that there are best practices that, like, for example, San Diego has licenses and restricts the quantity of short-term rentals and how do they do it. So I think there are cities that have done this well, that if Scottsdale were allowed to do that, they could follow those certain models. But the fact is that we just need to get back to Scottsdale being allowed to make these sorts of decisions for itself. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that clarification. So in part, your point too is that if it's locally controlled, it can go through a public outreach process here in Scottsdale, and Scottsdale can determine for itself what regulations it wants to have on it.
So Brent, in answer to David's question, he's describing a timeshare, and we define a timeshare in our zoning ordinance, and they don't seem to be permitted in single-family residential districts. So we have to look at it closely, because I just looked at it off the cuff here, but it may already be a non-issue, and that it may already be prohibited.
So it already appears to be prohibited in single-family residential neighborhoods, and would remain so unless the legislature preempted
us or the council changed the ordinance.
Yeah, got it. Okay, other comments? Bobby, go ahead.
Yeah, and this is the last part, and I appreciate Melissa's comments. And my point isn't to completely strike that out. My point is that it ought to be, and our recommendation should be that, whatever we're advocating for, whatever I guess the committee or the city is going to advocate for, should be more thoughtful than just, here's what we're going to do from a separation of footage. That's not going to solve the problem, A. And B, I think I would take issue with the assumption that other cities do it well. Like, I'm very familiar with other cities, and they're not done well. And I just want to make sure that that's 100% agreed upon by a number of folks in terms of how cities do it. So, I mean, I do understand the sentiment of the city taking more control. And
Bobby, you're breaking up for some reason. Maybe, but I think we got a sense of that. If not, what we can do is I'll call on you another minute. Carl, go ahead.
I just want to say that I respect Bobby's point of view, but I want to echo the sentiment that 9C should stay, and that we aren't talking about the fact that it's a zoning issue because it's not in the purview of this committee. It's not what we're supposed to do. But the reality is, when you start dealing with use, okay, that is zoning, and we're not allowed to do. That's the crux of this whole thing. So it's nothing we can do until the legislature and the city come to a meeting of the minds of how to proceed. And I think that 9C is an important paragraph to leave in.
Okay, thank you, Carl. Rebecca is next.
Yeah, in regards to 9C, on that first bullet point where it's talking about the ability to decouple the long term and the short term, and I think that is something that could give cities some more tools. I'm wondering, is that also looking towards decoupling the taxation, where you could have a differential for the tax?
I don't know. I think they are treated differently from a taxation standpoint, long-term versus short-term. So short-term has to pay the transient occupancy tax or the bed tax, and long-terms don't. So, but that's how the state is managing them, not the cities. But I may not be understanding your comment.
Oh, I'm sorry, is the TPC tax different for short-term and long-term?
Yes, that's my understanding. So there's the transient occupancy tax, which is like what's paid in hotels. That has been extended to the short-term rentals. That's not extended to the long-term rentals. So they are treated differently from a taxation standpoint. Whitney, I don't know if you want to add to that or if that's correct.
I don't
It's
know
just
off the
that-
top of my head, but I just messaged Terry to find out.
Okay. That's a different issue than the city being able to manage short-term rentals differently than long-term rentals. What that concept there is talking about is that the second component and state law that allows us to, oh gosh, I'm going to go back up here because it's easier for me to, I don't think it's actually in here. I know where it is, and I'm not going to be able to find it. I'm thinking about the state law. There's 1, 2, and 3 sections, and the second section talks about like nuisance related things, and they said that we can nuisance and noise related issues, and they say that we can regulate as long as we are consistent in how we do that between short-term, long-term, and single-family residences. And so that is what this decoupling one is talking about, is giving us the ability to have kind of nuisance and noise regulations different from short-term than long-term. Luis might be able to jump in and clarify that if needed to be clarified further.
What was the specific question? I'm sorry.
Rebecca, go ahead and ask your question again.
Yeah, I might be just confused myself. I thought there were 2 different taxes. One was the state did the transaction privilege tax, and the other, of course, is the lodging tax. So isn't there
the transaction privilege tax and then the bed tax?
That's the transient occupancy tax. Yes.
Yeah. So there are 2 taxes.
There's a sales tax
right, and my
on the rental of
question is-
property, and then there's also
And my question was, can you different, is it currently a different TPC amount for the short-term and long-term?
Yes, that's my understanding.
It's probably Whitney, do you know?
Yes, Brent is correct.
Thank you. That's nice. Whitney can text someone and then I find out that I'm correct, and I'm glad that I was correct in that, because
I'm sorry, I'm sorry, can you repeat that? Something was going on with my sound.
Sure. So there is a transaction privilege tax, a sales tax that's applied, and then to rentals, and then short-term rentals also have to pay the transient occupancy tax or the bed tax on top of it. So they are treated differently.
Correct. And maybe you answered this and I just missed it, but there is a different differential between on the TPC.
The long-term rentals do not have to pay the transient occupancy tax. So they don't have to pay the bed tax, because that's
I'm talking about the transaction privilege. I'm sorry.
Okay, so Whitney, do you want to clarify that further based on what you got from Terry?
Sorry, it took me a second to unmute. Briefly, I guess if it helps, the part that I got, sorry, I just got a quick message, was that the TPT is the 1.75 and the bed or the lodging tax that you're referring to is 5%. Does that help what you were asking, that they are different?
Yes, so they all pay the 1.75, and then short-term rentals pay the 5 on top of that. So they are treated differently. That's what I was trying to say without having the exact numbers. So thank you.
Yes.
Rebecca, does that help? You're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, I think I've got it straight now. So in other words, there is no way to have in this uncoupling a different additional different tax structure for short-term and long-term, if I'm understanding you.
Well, there is a different tax structure in that short-term rentals have to pay the bed tax in addition to the sales tax, to use the common terms. The city, not to go into too much detail on this, but there is a model city tax code, and whenever Scottsdale wants to do tax uses differently than what that standard is, we have to go before the commission and get approval for that. My understanding is this is not talking about the taxation issue, but instead the city, what regulations the city is able to do. So that I'm just trying to distinguish between those two issues. And so long-term rentals and short-term rentals are paying sales tax on property rental, and then the short-term rentals on top of that are also paying a bed tax. Rebecca, anything further on that?
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, David, go ahead. You're muted.
A comment on 9C was, in terms of changes that we could make, could we add in there somewhere the ability to apply the regulations for transient housing that are applicable to hotels to short-term rental properties, because they are housing the traveling public in accommodations that are very much like hotels, particularly if you have these places that are going to be renting to 6 or more people on an ongoing basis all the time. It's actually functioning as a hotel, and they should be subject to such things as, you got to have fire exits and fire extinguishers and regular, bed checks and things like that. So I just wondered if we could put something in there like that would give us ability to control them more along the lines of commercial rental properties, like more lines of commercial transient housing. Just a thought.
And this is Brad Lundahl. I apologize for coming on late. I've been watching the final actions of our legislature who have adjourned for the year. Yay. So in the first bullet, that's kind of one of the things I was getting at, being able to manage short-term rentals differently than long-term rentals. And that would include being able to treat them like hotels or regulate them like hotels. But if we wanted to spell that out separately, I'd be fine with that as well, just to make it clear.
Great. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. And Brad, I don't know if you saw it, but there was a extensive discussion about requiring online lodging market platforms to provide a disclosure of state laws and ordinances and require acknowledgement by owners, hosts, and renters. There's actually 3 things that got added related to that issue.
Yeah, I see that. Okay.
And it was actually mentioned that that's something similar to other disclosures that are required in real estate transactions. All right, any other comments, questions, observations under 9? Bobby, go ahead.
Hey, Brent, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, one other quick question I had is there is a push to try to create this association with hotels and regulate as hotels. My question is, as I'm listening to this, could there be unintended consequences about pushing too much like hotels in terms of, would there be other rights or privileges that would be given to short-term rentals because they become treated like hotels that they otherwise wouldn't be given or have those privileges?
Yeah, there always can be unintended consequences. So maybe we have it written right now, require short-term rentals to be applicable to the same laws as hotels. Maybe there's a clarification that can be made there. To avoid unintended consequences. Brad, any?
Yeah, you could maybe just say similar to laws that hotels follow. That way it gives you some wiggle room to kind of create those later on and make that conscious decision on what would work and what wouldn't.
And also, sorry, I'm stepping in, same sentence, change it or don't, but I think it came up that health and safety, the expense of health and safety issues was why the hotel industry was, they had to comply with all of these health and safety things, but then these other residential hotels didn't have to.
Yeah, that would be a good clarification. health and safety.
Let me just give you one example here. Is if it becomes a hotel classification, could the short-term rental now all of a sudden start serving food and drink and allowing licensees to come in and guests to come in? And you see them, could they start allowing day spas and pool uses on a per use basis? I mean, so those are the types of unintended consequences that I just, and obviously there's going to be pushback on that immediately, but I'm just saying those are considerations that pendulum never swings to the middle, I guess.
Yeah. So the clarifications may have precluded that because we're talking about public health and safety laws, not all requirements. Carl, go ahead. Or is your hand raised from before?
That was my point. Sorry.
Okay. All right. So I don't see any other hand raised at this point. And so what I am going to do is I'm going to take this and with the changes that have been made and send that to the city council and have it posted as part of tomorrow night's meeting. And this will, any of you or any members of the public can comment on these items at tomorrow night's meetings, and the council will give direction to staff. And our two council members that have been on the working group will make the presentations. Carl, go ahead.
Vice Mayor did say something about strengthening some of the verbiage. That is something you're going to work on with her?
My recollection was it was Council Member Millhaven, and
okay.
My understanding was she said that she would strengthen it in the presentation that she and the Vice Mayor were going to make to the council.
Thank you.
Councilmember Millhaven, am I relaying that accurately?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Vice Mayor Janik, go ahead.
I just kind of, as a summary statement, because it seems like we're just about finished. I wanted to thank all the participants and the staff for all the time and effort that's gone into this. And I think we've done a really good job of identifying the problems, but most importantly, I think we've come up with solutions to the problems. So fingers crossed that we can implement all these changes and that we'll definitely see a behavior with the short-term rental occupants. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice Mayor. Well said. Bobby, you have your hand raised?
Yeah, last one. I do really appreciate putting this together and getting everybody's input, especially on both sides of the ledger. One last question, and then I'll be done, I promise, is I know that the council will talk about these recommendations tomorrow. Will there be any follow-up that comes back to the working group on kind of what the perception is or feedback from the council is on each one of the measures?
Yes, certainly we can do that, getting a note out to the working group and also the interested parties that have been following along with this to let them know what the next steps are. So anticipating that the council may direct that we make these ordinance changes in here. I mean, I think our plan is to draft them over the summer and have something back to the council in early fall. And I do know that the online lodging marketplaces have contacted us, very interested in reviewing that as well. And as we would with any ordinances, we'll make sure there's time for the public and the business community to review those. But yeah, Kelly, please remind me to make sure that we get something out after the council meeting. It might not be till next week, but we'll get it out.
Will do.
Thank you so much. Any other closing comments? Then I do also express, as the Vice Mayor did, my profound appreciation to each one of you for being involved in this process. I know there were a lot of people in the community that were also interested in participating, and we really appreciate each one of them that has taken time to provide their comments and to dialogue with us about this very important issue. Councilmember Millhaven, I see that you're unmuted. Would you like to?
I just want to ditto thanks. I think Betty said it very well. I just want to thank everybody for their time. I'm really optimistic that we can have an impact here. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. You each very, very much. And please stay tuned. All right, thanks so much for your service on behalf of the city of Scottsdale. And so this concludes the last meeting of the working group. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you.